welcome to Stories and Lessons. This is Tim Winnicky with Empowered Change, and I'm very excited about today's episode with John Marx. John is a passionate, dedicated person to the responder community. He's got 23 years serving in uniform as a police officer. He's taken that experience and ran with it. He now is a nationally recognized expert in helping departments improve their resiliency, develop policies to support healthy communities and police officers and responders. And I'm lucky enough to work with him in an organization called ResponderStrong here in Colorado, where we're trying to coordinate care for responders all across the state. He has an amazing story. He talks a lot about both resiliency, the trauma that's involved with service, and how often we just ignore the needs of ourselves and our communities to try to keep it together while we serve. I couldn't be happier with how the interview went. He talks a lot about the different resources. We have some great conversations around what to do with ourselves to be better. I really hope you enjoy the episode. Let us know what you think after. Come on to Facebook at empowered.change.ce to let us know, or go to our website and email me. I'm always looking for feedback and ways to improve the podcast. Without further ado, let's get right into John and our conversation. Thanks so much for coming on, John. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you and I met through our work at ResponderStrong, and I know from reading a bit of your book and know a bit just from our conversations around each other that you've gone from being a police officer to helping people do advocacy. What do you primarily do other than the ResponderStrong stuff?
I would say that what I do now is kind of a combination of teaching, consulting, and a little bit of research. We'll get into this, but our organization provides wellness and resilience education and research. And we work primarily with law enforcement, but all emergency responders. We're really just trying to change the professions so that we take care of our people. Because certainly in law enforcement, if we don't take care of the people, or our people, we can't take care of the people. So, we really have to start doing a better job of taking care of our people that are out serving the public.
Well, I think that's why I've always really enjoyed you in the meetings, is that resiliency aspect. I think so often when people think of mental health and resiliency, they think of them when resiliency has failed.
Right.
Either they're John Wayne and they're so tough it doesn't matter, or they're just this broken crying heap. And I like that we both share the perspective of there's a lot of range in the middle there if we need to shoot for better.
There really is. And, I think in a lot of professions, we have taken these things for granted for certainly my entire lifetime, whether we're talking about military personnel or emergency service personnel, and I'm sure lots of other professions, but they have work that grinds down the human spirit, and we just can't shake that off. And in this day and age, with all the research, all the technology, all the support mechanisms that are available, we have no excuse to be doing that. But there is an educational barrier. We have to sort of change the paradigm and change the culture. We have to make people realize, wow, I don't have to suffer in silence. I can get support. And one of the ways I do that is tell people think of themselves as professionals, almost as if they were professional athletes. Professional athletes get all kinds of support and nurturing and encouragement and, trainers and dietitians and psychologists and, medical doctors. And if you twist your ankle, they're all over you. And, why don't we do that for our emergency responders? Because they have to be as sharp as possible, 24/7, 365.
Yeah. Well, and the amount of pressure on that view of that 365 and that having to be on is ratcheted up.
Yeah.
Right. With all of the video recording, all of the media that's really, it's hard not to see a very black and white us versus them mentality for those of us supporting the community and those impacted by bad policing policy.
Well, every person on the planet practically has a phone in their pocket that has a camera on it. Mm-hmm. And it's changing the public discourse, which I'm not saying is all bad, but we got used to CNN being instant live action news in my lifetime. And now, with Facebook streaming and all the other instant, broadcast mechanisms, you can broadcast from any street corner anywhere and everything is live.
Yeah.
And that's good in some respects, but sometimes, I don't know that the world is prepared to really understand how things happen live. It's like making sausage. Sometimes you really don't want to know what goes on. And, I have to say, I can speak for police work. I don't speak on behalf of my firefighter or EMT friends, but, law enforcement is not always pretty. It is not always easy. And, it doesn't always look like it does on television.
Well, and thank God, right? Like television had a really, really odd view of police work.
Yeah.
Like when I was a kid, I always remember the police dramas, the Dirty Harry movies. And I see a lot of this idea that the warrior ethos for police versus the military, and it really starts to make me concerned. Yeah. Because my favorite police officers, the ones I remember from a kid that helped me connect, they weren't anybody you'd mess with, right? They were men of authority, but they were also men that I was comfortable going to in a bad part of town.
Yeah.
Right. There wasn't a fear associated with reaching to them. And I think in those movies, like I distinctly remember there was a scene in Dirty Harry where he just slaps somebody out of nowhere for like saying something to him.
Yep.
And that was my dad's generation.
Right.
And I think with all of the problems that the instant video and everything is doing, it's also making us ask questions about what the community owes to the responders.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think that in my lifetime, we've kind of grown up with the fantasy of movies and television. I mean, it's different than it is in literature, but we have been and it's not just about cops and firefighters. It's about, Ozzie and Harriet and the Roseanne Barr family and, all those, lots of family shows.
Yeah.
That, we've been sort of fed a fantasy about not only how good things can be, but sometimes how bad they can be. Even with reality television, with Jerry Springer and all the many, many courtroom and talk shows that just get out of control, I think we're feeding a fantasy. I think that in some of those bad ones, people just go out of their way to be obnoxious. Maybe they're that way naturally. I don't know. But it seems like sometimes we're fueling the two extremes and we're forgetting the mainstream is the bell curve and it's the middle of the road. It's in our case, American society. And we're not that different than other societies around the world. And I just think that people are starting to see the dichotomy, the two extremes, and not recognizing that a lot of things happen in the middle. And they're not pretty, but they're not horrible, and they're not fantasy wonderful. And love, isn't always the way it ends up in the movies, and lots of things. So,
yeah. Well, and I love the way that this idea of the middle and the bell curve has come up in some of our discussions at ResponderStrong. Yeah. Because as a therapist, that's really what I shoot for with my clients. The first call I get is, I just want to be happy again, man. Yeah. Like that's every client that calls me. Then I'm like, well, we call that manic. If you just want to be happy all the time, that's a diagnosis. That's not really the way to be in the world. And there's times when it's inappropriate for you not to be happy, for you to feel any number of a broad range of experience.
Yeah.
And I think what's scary for our responders is if their scale is happy, neutral, or feeling in crisis when they're supposed to bring order in a crisis.
Yeah.
That line between okay and not is so thin and gets so fragile after the years.
Well, and there is, on top of that, I call it the police perfection paradox in my book, because I love to coin terms that get people to talk. But, I think the public has an unrealistic expectation of what law enforcement or firefighters or any emergency responders can do for them based on the fact that on television, everything is resolved perfectly in 30 minutes or 60 minutes. And, it all works out. And nothing in life is that simplistic. And it's not that cut and dry. And it's not that that easy to understand. When we're talking about human mental health, it's a pretty complex thing. And so if we switch that around, talking about the people we have to respond to help is pretty challenging. But when you reverse the mirror and you put it back on us, for anyone to assume that our mental health is completely stable and rock solid is just living in a fantasy world. It is not that easy. And yet we've made no preparations basically over the years to really support the people we send out into the world and that have to deal with the worst tragedies and traumas, and expect that they're just going to brush that off and go right back to home and come right back to work the next day without being phased at all. That's absurd.
Well, and especially as the responsibility is increased. One of the programs that I think we've talked about was the uniformed clinicians responding to mental health calls in Colorado now.
Yeah.
The program that started out in Boulder. And
and it's all over the country too, in different forms.
Yeah, well, it made a lot of sense to me because one of the things that I hear from the officers that come into the office to work with me is they're feeling this pressure to both provide physical security and safety, provide a public relations person, and be able to react appropriately like a social worker.
Yeah.
And those are all three very nuanced, complex jobs that someone should hold, not being a guy armed trying to de-escalate a mental health call.
Right.
Like it just doesn't work.
Yeah, that's just a couple of the hats. I mean, honestly, when I think about it, it's social worker, chaplain, bartender. It's like we are asked to take on all kinds of roles. Firefighter. I actually got a cat out of a tree once. I mean,
man, right out of an old comic.
When you're at the other end of 911, you're expected to handle everything. I've been called to plumbing problems, and somebody's leaves fell onto my lawn, and it just all kinds of strange stuff. In addition to all kinds of horrible things, and lots of death and destruction, and tragedy, and poverty, and trauma, and to think that we would bounce right back from that, even for us to think we would, is just absurd.
I agree. So how long were you in uniform?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was in law enforcement for a total of 23 years. I started as a reserve deputy. For those that know Colorado, I started here in the Boulder County Sheriff's Office while I was still attending the University of Colorado. And then I went to work for the city of Westminster, which is a suburb of Denver, and I was there for 21 years. And so I was in patrol a couple of times in both of those functions, but I spent more of my time actually in non-uniformed assignments. I was a public information officer. I was a public education person. I was a detective. I administered our community policing project. I was a trainer. I was on our SWAT team for 19 years. I did a lot of things. So it's not just about being in uniform. It is about, for me, seeing all kinds of facets of a law enforcement career.
Well, and that of all the jobs you described, the thing that struck me was community education and SWAT. And it sounds like those were at the same time.
They were, because the SWAT pretty much was I did it for a little over 19 years at Westminster. And so there would be times where both phones ring and I'm being called out as the public information officer to deal with the media, and being called I was on the hostage negotiation team or the crisis negotiation team. And so I'd get a call for that. And that obviously was the priority. So that one always trumped the other one. So then they'd find somebody else to back me up in the PIO function. The same thing was true as a detective. I always joked, and it actually contributed to my burnout, is that I was on call multiple ways through the majority of my career. Mm-hmm. And that takes its toll too, because you really don't have a normal semblance of any kind of schedule or a life. In patrol, you can be called into court on your days off. As a public information officer, as a SWAT team member, inevitably the calls came in the middle of the night.
Naturally.
And for the most part, as a detective and a PIO, as working day shift. And so, vacations and holidays and everything were always a challenge.
Well, and it's interesting to me to hear the on-call stress. because I can really relate to that. In the military, I always held a crisis line because of my role as a victim's advocate. And the military, if something comes on, if somebody goes sick, 24-hour operations, you go.
Right. Yeah.
And so I figured that I had the skill set to handle that. So when I got out and I stepped back into advocacy roles, I was like, yeah, give me the crisis line. That's fine. I'm used to this.
Uh-huh.
And 3 years later, I finally realized that I hadn't had a good night's sleep in 8 years.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And finally just put the
Therapist,
phone
heal
down.
thyself.
Right. And I was right when I stepped from advocacy into clinical work.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost like that allowed me the permission to be like, no, I need to be focused and attentive for this hour, every hour, and then get to go home.
Right.
But it is exhausting to try to flip hats like that. And to constantly have to be just able to switch.
Right.
Hit it.
Well, the other thing, I've heard a lot of people make the same joke. I've always said the airlines have it right when they say, first, put on your own oxygen mask before you try to help somebody else. But no one thinks about that in their everyday lives.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly people that respond to crises really ought to be considering that. And as you mentioned, sleep is one of those things that is so critical to the human function that we take for granted. And so many emergency responders, or actually anybody working any kind of shift work, is messing with their circadian rhythm, and it is much more challenging to their emotional health, much less their physical health. Yeah. So, there are just so many things that we've learned about in the last couple of decades, I think, and we have to start paying attention to. And I honestly think so many people are not, and more importantly, so many leaders, whatever that role is, so many leaders are not really paying attention and taking care of their people.
Yeah, and it seems to come from the old timers of, it's what got me here. Do it like me, and if you can't get it out, this job isn't for you.
Right.
That's the consistent feedback I get from the guys that get into my office.
Well, yeah, it's the way we've always done it.
Right, and that should be good enough, despite the fact that there's a changing world, despite the fact that fully automatic weapons on the street have now skyrocketed, and the response is it's a very different world from imagine when you started at the beginning of your career than it is now.
Absolutely. Honestly, I've been retired for a number of years. It's a very different world now than it was when I retired. And I do think, I've seen some of the educational programs that talk about how fast technology is changing our world. And, I think it's down to, massive change happens every few years. Yeah. I don't know the direct statistics, but I mean, when you think of cell phones and all the changes that are going on with those, and I remember when we first got our first cell phone at the police department, it was in a suitcase. So, and that wasn't that long ago, but even just with the capability of all the smartphones and all the things they do, and the photography on your phone, and the capability of broadcasting, and, our society in so many ways, but I think technology is leading the way, is changing so rapidly. I think 5, 6, 8 years and things are dramatically different. So our professions are changing at that rate as well.
Hmm. Well, so going into that change idea, so you did police work for 20 years.
Yep, a little over.
What did you do right after that 23 years was up and you got out?
Well, I mean, you and I were talking beforehand. A little bit of the backstory here is that I really burned out in my job. And at the time, I thought it was just me. I thought that I was just not capable of handling it, and I was smart enough and capable enough to get out. I had financial backup. I've always been an entrepreneur. I had big ideas. I knew that I could exist outside of my career identity. But I did recognize that I was really internalizing a lot of things. I don't think we've talked about it here on this program, but I was suicidal at one point, actually 2 points in my career, and actually had the mechanics of a plan designed to take my own life because I just couldn't deal with it any longer. Let me take this one approach. First of all, I didn't. I I attribute a lot of that to my parents, both of which, by the way, were mental health professionals. Well, I always joke that I was the black sheep of the family. I became a hostage negotiator. But, my parents raised me well, and I am an optimistic person. I think they raised me with a sense of optimism. And as a negotiator, I always knew that suicidal thoughts, for the most part, are very impulsive, and that sense of desperation and depression generally will pass. And I think in my case, the sun rose the next morning and things were better. And even when I was going through a period of hard times, things got better. I just endured long enough to let them get better. And I think so many people that are in crisis don't recognize there's any way out. So I want to make that point. We can circle back to that. But I was burned out, and I attribute that. I knew at the time that it had to do with dead kids. I did take a PTSD assessment several years after I retired. I did not meet the threshold for a diagnosis of PTSD. And I've read that. I know what that is. But I suffered. And I think a lot of cops can identify with that as I talk to them around the country and around the world when I teach. I think a lot of people can identify with having to do with crimes and tragedies involving children. In my case, I went to 2 house fires that killed a total of 7 children. I was at several traffic accidents that killed infants and children. I was labeled the king of SIDS death on my patrol shift when I was a rookie, because inevitably it seemed like I was the one that got the SIDS calls. And I am so grateful that our medical profession has risen to the challenge, and SIDS deaths are so there's so many fewer of them nowadays than there were when I started. But nonetheless, when you see children who are so innocent die tragically, and in some cases they were murdered, shaken babies, and we had a husband-wife dispute where the husband shot the wife and also the infant. So all of that somehow seemed to pile up on me. And in addition to that, I think when I teach, I talk about, I don't think it matters if you're a cop in Metropolis or Mayberry. We see the same things, maybe not in the same doses, but we see the same things. And, the crazy cat lady that had 123 cats, the hoarder that had so much trash piled up in their house, you had to take pathways to go to the various rooms and it smelled horrible. Just abject poverty. We had train derailments, and we had plane crashes, and we had a 70 some odd car pile up fatal accident. And, so I was involved in all kinds of things that I think peaked the scale of horrific, that I just knew was taking its toll on me. And what happened was it changed my personality. It made me depressed. It made me grumpy. I had a charmed career. I was a golden child most of my career, but I was burning all kinds of bridges at the end. And I just knew that I had changed, and I just didn't know exactly why. I had sought out mental health treatment a couple of times in my career for various things. Usually I had an excuse like marital problems or whatever, but I actually went through EMDR therapy for one very horrific death, and it was very, very helpful. So I think, with my upbringing and some treatment and kind of a general positive outlook, I managed to persevere. But I knew when I left, I knew it was time for me to go. And I thought a lot of it was just me. If you don't mind, if I can carry this a little further, a couple of years after I retired, one of my friends in law enforcement who had also retired committed suicide. Mm-hmm. And his death really opened up my eyes. I started talking about it more. I found out that 2 of the neighboring agencies that I worked next to for 20 years had multiple suicides in the last couple of years that I never heard anything about. I don't believe any of my peers did. We never talk about it. Suicide is one of those things we don't talk about in our profession because I think people believe it's shameful, and I think that's so wrong. Can talk about that too, but it opened my eyes and made me realize that I wasn't alone going through what I went through. And also kind of opened my eyes to a new discussion. And that is what's led me on the path I'm on now. And that's when I started writing about the issues I experienced. I started blogging. I'd always been a law enforcement trainer, so I started training specifically on this issue, the issue of wellness and resilience. And in my mind, it has to be comprehensive wellness and resilience. It isn't just about a Band-Aid or a flavor of the month fix. And I started writing. It took me 8 years to finish the book that I wrote called Armor Yourself, How to Survive a Career in Law Enforcement. And one of the first things I did is I realized I was not the expert. I was the old burned out cop. So I started finding psychologists that had expertise that I needed. I started finding chaplains that had the expertise I needed. Over the years, I've assembled this amazing cadre, some of which I teach with, people that just, are truly the best in their field in these kind of issues. And briefly, my belief is that comprehensive wellness is physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And even though some of my colleagues differentiate how those are aligned, the reason I break out mental and emotional is that I think in emergency response, you have to take into effect the cognitive function. Mm-hmm. And so I put emotional health under the banner of what we all call mental health. And under the banner that I use for mental well-being, it has to do with cognitive function. And that includes things like memory and reaction times and, mental processing speed and language and calculation and curiosity and problem solving. And, I don't think you lump those in with traditional emotional well-being. And I think the approach to strengthening yourself in those areas is different. So that's how I've written my material. And, I've seen a lot of people call it intellectual growth and other things, but I just think that in emergency response, we have to address the entire bandwidth. And I'll relinquish the mic here in a second. One of the things I have to say, one of the best people that I came across in my exploration was Chaplain Kerry Friedman. Mm-hmm. I think most people in law enforcement have read the book Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement, written by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin, a retired officer who became a psychologist and wrote that book 20 some odd years ago and has been ringing the bell in law enforcement for all those years, saying we've got to take care of our emotional well-being. And we haven't learned. We're very slow to learn. But Chaplain Friedman wrote the book Spiritual Survival for Law Enforcement, which I had read. I was too intimidated to call him, so fortunately he called me. This is a guy who designed the curriculum at the FBI National Academy and helped the FBI create what they call tools for intentional spirituality. And I'm not terribly religious. And so, like I think many responders, I kind of back away when somebody starts talking about religion. But what Kerry helped me realize is that there is so much more to the discussion of spiritual strength than just religion. Religion is another component of that. But particularly in law enforcement, we're talking about honor and integrity and a code of ethics and, truth. It's so many things that hit the spiritual realm, even probably compassion. It's kind of an overlap in emotional. But, there are so many things that we have to address there. And yet we don't, because we don't want to cross that path between church and state. And we think, religion is something you leave to the home, which I agree. But there are so many things we can talk about in our professions that have to do with this spiritual strength or substance that a human being has that needs to be incredibly strong in particularly law enforcement. When you talk about corruption and, callousness and, murderous intent, the way we deal with those, in my opinion, is that spiritual component. And I've always been a prevention person. I'm not on the treatment side of this. But I think, we have got to start talking about these things in our professions so that we can address them, so we can strengthen and condition ourselves not to fall into some of the traps that I think I fell into, and obviously my friend who took his life, and many others. It's not just the ones that die or take their lives. It's the ones that are still living, suffering in silence, and still working, probably not at the capacity they need to be at. That's what scares me.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that We haven't really talked about it a lot on the podcast, so I'm gonna focus in because that was a lot.
Yes, it was. Sorry about
It's almost as though you've got 20 years of experience doing this. But the spiritual end of that, particularly when you're talking about the power of the responder, and
that.
particularly the power of a badge and a gun, right?
Yeah.
You don't get to not get corrupted by power without some kind of spiritual or ethical validation of yourself.
Right.
And consistently what I see in the departments when I go by or when I speak to the officers individually is it's spoken about at academy.
Sometimes.
It's given lip service in most of the departments because no one wants to look underneath. Everybody just wants to accept that by wearing the uniform, we meet the standard.
Right.
Because it's a scary thing.
Well, I hope, and I have to believe that everybody meets the standard when they get hired. I mean, I hope we're not hiring unethical, corrupt, murderous people, violent. I just don't believe that. I'm sure that some slip through for the wrong reasons. But nonetheless, I think our hiring processes, they could probably be tweaked, but I think we're doing the right thing. The issue is what happens after 3, 5, 10, 20 years on the job. And honestly, I don't want to throw a number down. It could be 2 days on the job. And something horrible happens, it changes you for the rest of your life.
Well, and then there's the big one that I see a lot because I hear a lot of the shame stories.
Yeah,
doing my work, and it's this sense of false equivalency, right? It's this officer who did something that they know they shouldn't have, but was small, right? Like let a friend off, followed him home rather than giving him a DUI.
Yeah,
something like that, right?
Yep.
And then all of a sudden they're like, well, now I no longer can hold anybody else in the department accountable for any of this litany of horrible things that might be going on.
Yep. We talk about a slippery slope, one small step and then you're slipping down.
Well, and the vast majority of them, it's a small step. They're human.
Right.
We all make the small ones. There's no one that I know that given a chance to be honest and safe won't tell you something they've slipped on. Right. But then all of a sudden they're that shame spiral where they're afraid that someone might look back at them. They're never going to call anybody else out. And then that shame just gets toxic.
Yeah.
And it makes the next slip easier.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Oh, and it sounds like that's a little bit of what you theorize happened to your friend that you lost to the suicide.
Nobody knows for sure, and that's a kind of a typical thing. I do know that some of the studies I've read, when we talk about suicide, law enforcement suicide particularly, there are a significant number of notes or what's left behind that talks about a loss of hope. And hope is one of those things that I put into that spiritual quadrant of the human being. And so in my classes, I challenge them, where do you get hope? Where does it come from? And how do you lose it? Mm-hmm. I think we can talk about how we lose it, but where do we get it? That's the other challenge. And that's the whole point. We have to start training ourselves. In my lingo, I talk about strengthening and conditioning. Mm-hmm. I think, we go through the police academy, for example, and we do an awful lot of physical strengthening and conditioning. And strengthening is, building the muscles, and conditioning is the process that we do it over a period of time so that it becomes a habit. And, we all know that we're not going to run faster by running around the block once. So the conditioning piece is that strengthening piece over and over and over again. And I believe that what we're missing is that we're not doing it physically, emotionally, and mentally. All four, spiritually. We're doing it physically. We're not doing it mentally, emotionally, and spiritually in addition to that. And I believe, and that's what I wrote, I believe that there are techniques that you can learn, and I've created some, but this is a wide open field. Everyone can come up with their own, but I think you have to find ways to strengthen yourself spiritually, regularly, to strengthen yourself emotionally, regularly. The emotional piece is pretty woo-woo for most, but whether you want to call it meditation or I call it quiet time, in order to strengthen your mental response, your emotional response, you have to learn to be quiet. You have to learn to do what a lot of people call meditation. And it's horrible. It's really hard. I don't think most people realize how hard it is to condition yourself to be still and not judge what's going through your mind. And so take that to the spiritual component. How do you do that? How do you condition hope? Well, I think those things can be done. I think you just find exercises, you repeat them, you challenge yourself, you discuss with other people. And I think we can prevent some of the problems we're having by taking a different approach to comprehensive wellness and, doing something to take care of the human body that unfortunately didn't come with an owner's manual. So we're kind of winging it.
Well, and I think it goes into the department ideal. One of the things that I got lucky on with early on in my military careers, I had a commander who he's now a 1-star general. He was probably the best person I ever served under. And he was talking to us and he said, "Hey, we're all stationed here. Make sure you're spending time with your family and with your church if you've got one, because we don't always get to do that. So while it's here, you need to." And then he lived it. Every day, the man might work a 14-hour day because he was a commander, but he was always home for dinner with his wife and kids.
Yeah.
And if you got lunch with him, generally you had to go thank his wife because that was her hour with him during the day away from the kids.
Wow.
And what I kept from that was the big thing he said about it was the military family and the mission is absolutely important, and it's going to be here for you while you're here. Your career is likely not going to be your whole life. Your family is what's going to be on in 40 years. So you need to attend to that now. And what I see so often in the responder community is we forget to not be in crisis. We're in crisis management.
Right. That's
right?
what we do.
Well, that's what we should do. But instead, in our own lives, in our own departments, we react like crisis. If there's nothing immediately going on fire, we sit there and try to recoup in the best way without any guidance versus leaving that space. Purpose. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We are, what I meant was we're constantly in crisis mode.
Yeah.
Because we don't know how to turn that off. So we take it home and everything's a crisis there. And yeah, it's just an ugly cycle.
Or just acknowledging when there isn't a crisis at work and there's a crisis at home.
Right. Yeah.
Like that's the big one too, right? How many officers have made critical mistakes on the job because that morning they got into a drag out fight with their wife? Like
I'm sure a lot.
Just a few, right?
Yeah.
And we're not leaving space for it. And yeah, there's going to be bad days. There's going to be that 70-car pileup. There's going to be those days where it's a grueling week based on an event. But the only way to get ready and push through that is like what you were talking about. Attend to all 4 aspects.
Yeah.
Right. Almost all my clients are solid in the gym. They've got leg day, they've got arm day. I don't got any guys with the thin calves, right? They all know how to do like rotation and work out appropriately. But when all of a sudden I bring in emotion and I bring in interpersonal connection, they can't attend to those yet.
Yeah. Right. Well, and blame our society to a certain extent. I don't know that we've ever built mechanisms like that for anyone. I mean, some particularly well-educated parents perhaps raise their children really, really well. I think every parent worries about where they're going to go and how they're going to turn out, and many of them helicopter around and don't do the best they could do. But when we're talking about military professionals or emergency service professionals, these are the people that really should be the healthiest of our society. I mean, honestly, if you want them to come into your house in the middle of the night and in an emergency, you really expect them to be tip top and 100% and professional and compassionate and ready to engage if there's a bad guy lurking in your bushes. And I don't think people give a second thought to how are we keeping them that way.
No.
And I think in our professions, we're not giving that a second thought either. We are just assuming that because we were good to go once, we're still good to go. And that's a major fallacy.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that a lot. I see that all the time. And I know that you and I have had numerous discussions just around funding that idea.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody loves the cops when they come and stop the bad guy.
Right.
But no one wants to pay for them any other time than that.
Yep. And yeah, our organization's been seeking funding for years, and it's tough. I mean, the agencies don't have it because they're constantly, and I can't speak for others, but in law enforcement, every time something major happens, there's a new mandate about how we will change our behavior or change our protocol or change our procedures. And, many of those are unfunded. Frequently,
Yep. The unfunded mandate's always the best mandate.
Yeah, there's no money to make it happen. But agencies have to adapt. They have to provide new training. They have to retool their procedures. They have to change their equipment, whatever it happens to be. And there's just, there's so many demands on them, and there's just not enough money. And then, recruiting is a challenge these days. And the labor force is down, and trying to get people to go to specialty training is a challenge too. So there are so many obstacles to trying to make these changes. And yet, I'll say it right here, this is my legacy in life. I am not going to stop doing what I'm doing. I'm not going to stop beating this drum. It's a change that needs to happen. We maybe haven't found the way it's going to happen yet. And maybe I won't even be involved. But nonetheless, we need to make some changes, and we're going to have to find a way to make it work.
Well, and it seems like you're ahead of the game a little bit as far as how to make the changes on an individual level, like your family background, right? You knew intrinsically the valuable aspect of help. Your parents weren't going to let you not get help, right? Yeah. None of us therapists deal with this without believing in it, right?
Right.
And then at the end, you had the strength of character and resilience from using help along the way, that when you lost that friend and got angry about it, you had the capacity to go and do something about it.
Well, I thank you for saying that. I that's true. I tried a couple of, when I left law enforcement, I wanted to be done because I wanted to be away from the negativity that comes with the profession. I mean, sometimes we're the most negative people on earth, and I just didn't want to deal with that. But my friend's death kind of brought me back around, and I realized that I'd experienced this and didn't recognize that it was, an issue that other people faced. And I was a trainer, and I had the capacity, so yeah. I mean, the proverbial Roadrunner safe landed on my head, and referring to the cartoon, and so something hit me on the head, and then it made me wake up and say, all right, I can make a change here. I see one outlet. I'm a trainer. I can get the best information that's available out there. I can digest it and try to make it easy to incorporate into what I know as was my profession. And I can lead the charge. And, you and I are involved in an organization here in Colorado called ResponderStrong. Started with just a small handful of people, and now it's up well over 500 volunteers from all facets of emergency service around our state, about to go beyond our borders. And, there is an uprising, an upswell of people that want to make change. And there are a lot of good ideas out there, and I think we just have to do something. And you just said it a second ago. I wanted to capitalize on that. I think everything in life starts with individual leadership. You start with yourself first. You put on your oxygen mask first, take care of yourself, and then you role model it like the general you described. You role model it for other people, and you learn from them, and they learn from you. We grow together, as opposed to what we traditionally do, and that is we isolate ourselves. We become the lone wolf, and we think it's just us, like I did, and we don't talk about anything, and that's a big mistake.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that not talking about it, that's where we lose guys, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I could have my numbers off now because it's been a little while, but we just lost 3 this summer of folks still in uniform. And we know that when police officers explicitly retire, on average, you all are surviving 3 years.
Yeah, I've heard different things on that, but I'm concerned. The one that I use is that the life expectancy of a law enforcement officer is 66, and that's a few years old, but it probably coincides with a lot of the other statistics that are just told in different ways. But that's frightening. That's way too young. You get to Ollie Ollie Oxenfree, and there's no living happily ever after. That's just a crime. So we need to change. One thing I can tell you about suicide stats, I haven't checked it this week, but just a week or so ago, for the first time I've seen in a long time, this far into the year, the law enforcement suicide statistics had exceeded the national line of duty death numbers. So, suicides always outdo the number of officers that have been murdered. That's a number 2 to 3 times higher in suicides than murdered cops. But line of duty deaths is usually about 140, 150 on average a year. And most of them, the majority of them, are accidental deaths. And I'm not saying they're, I'm not minimizing anything. These people were killed in traffic accidents or whatever. But they're not, outright homicides. But the number of suicides just a week or so ago for the year 2018 passed the number of line of duty deaths in total. And that's appalling. Part of it is because we're paying attention, and I think we're finding more reporting than we have in the past. But, that's just wrong. We are a profession that is so rigorously selected and examined and, tested when we are hired that we shouldn't have anywhere near the rate of the general public. And yet we have way too many. So we've got to do something. And what I think we're missing is that, mental health component of just taking care of the whole person and not just physical fitness.
And the other thing that I immediately think of is the black and white picture of law enforcement that's out in the world right now. Either, if you're from the civilian side of things, either you're for cops and everything they do,
right,
and a racist at that point, right, immediately labeled,
well,
or you're against all cops everywhere having any power to do the things we demand of them, and you're for these communities that have been traumatized.
Yeah.
And that doesn't leave any room. And I know those stories hurt the people still in uniform. I know watching the news comes up. I watched it on ride-alongs. I see it come up in my office. Getting away from this narrative that every person in uniform is a black and white story has got to stop. Because then either internally, their story's bad, they're over. They're done. They're out of gas and there's no improving. Or externally, why fund it?
Right. Or we think privatizing it will make it better.
Oh yeah, because that's gone great in prisons.
And anywhere else for that matter. I think again, it's that dichotomy. We push everything to the extremes. Now, I'll be the first to say, and I still talk to a lot of my friends that are still working, the vast majority of the public doesn't give much thought about this at all. Because they don't interact with the police very often. And, they would support us if they were asked, but, it's not on the top of their radar because they're dealing with bills and family and all the other things we all deal with. And I've met plenty of people that have come from criminal backgrounds, gang backgrounds, who, when they needed the cops, they were really glad we were there. And, again, so we recognize that it is a small percentage of people that either hate the cops or, go out of their way to show they love the cops. But it's the middle that, again, we've got to deal with because they're not paying attention. And at some point we need to decide how important is public safety and what kind of energy and funding and things do we want to put into that, because we are constantly being barraged with needs of education and needs of health insurance and lots of other demands for our tax dollars. But we tend to take for granted the fire station down the street that will come to your house in a couple of minutes when you're crying for help, or the police officer that's driving around in the middle of the night that'll be there as quickly as they can when you need them. And, we can belabor this point, but I think ultimately, I was going to say one of the things that I made clear in my book is that I think resilience is a topic that human beings aren't all that comfortable with. There's not even a really good definition. We don't have a way to test for it per se. A lot of people will tell you they can, but I don't think they do.
No.
And to me, resilience is a multi-layered component. We have to talk about the individuals, but we also have to have an agency that is healthy and resilient, because I just don't think healthy cops or firefighters or whatever can thrive in an organization that is not healthy. No. And then going beyond that, I think, the most of the historic discussion about resilience comes in communities. And when we talk about social capital and other support systems in our society, I think that's a component we neglect, and that is I can't imagine what it's like to police in an unhealthy community. I don't know what's happening in Ferguson, Missouri today, but it was such a flashpoint for the country. I hope that the law enforcement officers in the community are breaking down those barriers and trying to reconnect and find the ability to work together, because I just don't think you can be a healthy police officer in an unhealthy community, or be a healthy community member surrounded by unhealthy cops, for that matter. And I think the one issue here, and I was a community policing administrator for a couple of years. We've got to break down those barriers. We got to get people to talk about, our common goals, our common links, our common concerns, and put aside some of the generalities about prejudice and deal with what's right there in the neighborhood right that minute, and see where we can't come together. And that, to me, builds resilience on multiple layers.
Well, and I think I like the social capital idea because it comes up so often with my clients.
Mm-hmm.
By the time they come to me, they're guys, so they're not coming in just when it's, I've got a little bit of a problem, right? They're waiting till everything's on fire.
Yep.
And they get well pretty quickly, right? Just by getting the shame out, just by talking about it.
Sure.
But then they're out of social capital, right? Their family's tired of their crap. Their job is tired of their crap. And now not only are they stuck dealing with where they've been, they're stuck kind of having to refill that piggy bank.
Yep.
Right. And that reminder that it takes 10 good things on average to kind of remove the stain of one bad thing. And having patience with each other enough to get there.
Yeah.
That's where it all comes back.
That's a challenge. And it's a challenge to do when, things are in crisis, whether it's a community in crisis or an individual in crisis. Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. We've got to get rid of the stigma of what we call mental health in our society, because we've got to start asking for help a whole lot sooner. Yeah. And that's my point about thinking about a professional athlete. You want to be going to the trainer, so to speak. You want the mental health trainer, because you want to get stronger and stay strong, stay in the game, and not wait until, you've been bulldozed and you've let everything go for way too long. And that was such a good point. We've got to, have early warning systems that work. And we have to have individuals that are willing to accept. And the one piece I haven't talked about is our culture, and that you talked about it with the John Wayne syndrome earlier. I'm old enough to remember John Wayne. I really liked him. He was a great hero figure, but he's a fictional. He was mostly a fictional character, and
entirely.
Yeah. And so we've got to start recognizing that we have to take care of ourselves. We can create our own persona, but we have to maintain it. And so getting some help to maintain it, whether it be from the chaplain or the mental health professional or the fitness trainer or the nutritionist, we've got to be, staying in the game. And it's a change in mentality. It's a change in our culture. And one of the first steps is to ask for help.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably a solid portion to kind of end the story and the lesson, right?
Yeah, I think so.
So I know about your book. I'm just about a third of the way through it.
So, good luck. 458 pages. Not exactly what I wanted when I started, but that's the way.
Well, it's hard to throw away. Like, how do you trim down in 8 years of work? And there hasn't been a chapter that I would done without so far.
Well, good.
So it's really well written. Especially what I've liked about it is I'm not in that world. I serve that world.
Yeah.
And it's relatable enough for me to get a clearer picture about what's going on. Oh, so if nothing else, you should know that your work is impacting mine. So thank you for that. I know you also do a lot of speaking and education at departments around the country. If people wanted to talk to you to figure out how they can partner with you or learn more about your book, etc., where should they go?
We have a bunch of websites, but the most pertinent ones are copsalive.com, which is a blog site that I started years ago when I retired and after my friend's suicide. And it's general information, no advertising. It's written primarily by emergency responders, mostly cops, for other cops and emergency responders. And there's a lot of information there, so that's a great place to start. Our business website is lawenforcementsurvivalinstitute.org. Sorry about that. It's a whole mouthful. That is our organization. We are the Law Enforcement Survival Institute, and we are a collection of those experts that I talked about earlier that, that partner with me to go and talk to law enforcement particularly. We're starting to do some firefighters. But, I'm not the psychologist. I'm not the chaplain. So I bring those experts with me. I'm not the fitness trainer. I'm not the wellness person. I'm not the mentoring coach. So we have those experts. And then you mentioned the book. The short title of the book is Armor Yourself. That's 3 different words, not yourself, but yourself, the inner you. And there is a website dedicated to the book at armoryourself.com. It talks a little bit about our training programs as well. So any of those 3 would be great. Thanks for asking.
Good. And I'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. And if there's one thing, what's the call that you love to get from people now?
Well, it's been interesting. I've talked to a number of people out of suicide, and I've talked to 4 or 5 cops out of suicide now. I like to know that what we're doing, and that would include you and me and so many other people, what we're doing is making a difference. And when somebody says, wow, you saved my life, or wow, you made a difference, I think that's the important message here, that there are a lot of people doing good work. We have to collaborate. We have to, keep pushing, and we will make a difference. And then we'll tag off to whoever comes after us, and hopefully they will continue to make a difference. But we need change, and I think a lot of us have to keep working at it.
I think that's the trick. I think especially in this land of social media and instant gratification and instant excitement, so many people forget that the work for real change doesn't happen in a week.
Right.
And if nothing else, your career has proven that.
Yeah. Let me throw out one more book idea. I was thinking of this earlier in the discussion. Angela Duckworth has written an outstanding book called Grit. And I was thinking about it when you were talking about her earlier, or talking about some of the concepts earlier about, we can all have talent, but really the critical thing that she talks about is you just have to have that determination, that grit to persevere. And that's what we're talking about here. I think that's a big component of resilience. And, her work is excellent. So, you mentioned it. I was thinking about it. Now they can read all kinds of stuff.
Perfect. I like that. I think we'll close there solely because anytime that 2 guys like us get around talking about it, people start to check out, well, sometimes you just got to be tough, right? And I love how her book acknowledges that. Yes, it is important to be tough. It's not either or. So thanks so much for coming on, John. It really means the world to me. It's nice to connect with you outside of a board meeting where we're arguing over language and resiliency.
We're working on standards, so it takes time.
All right. Take care of yourself. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome.
That was our interview with John Marx. I couldn't be happier with how it came out. One of the things I love about working with John is how much he knows and how comfortable he is correcting me. So he's one of my go-to sources for information. His website, Cops Alive, is fantastic. His blog is wonderful. One of the things I said that after listening to it, I felt was a little misleading, as I mentioned that the average length of survival after retirement for officers is 3 years. I get that information from a man named Dr. Stone. It's mostly due to health issues coming from working night shift, eating poor food, and the lifestyle of the stress. Most police officers and responders come out of it with different heart issues, different health issues. So it's not just the suicide angle that ends up costing us the lives of the people who get to retirement. Like John said, 67 is a little lower than the norm. So I hope that helps clarify some of that. Again, I'm sorry in the moment in the interview that I messed that up. For more information about John, you'll want to go to any number of his resources. The first one is his book that he talked about, which I highly recommend. I've really enjoyed reading it. It's definitely improved my work, called Armor Yourself. You can find that at armoryourself.com. For information about his organization, Cops Alive, go to www.copsalive.com. And if you're interested in having him and his team come into your community and helping you all develop out more resiliency standards and healthier policing, go to lawenforcementsurvivalinstitute.org. All these are going to be in the show notes. We also talked about a number of other professionals and books, but the one that stuck out for me that I really recommend anyone read would be Grit by Angela Duckworth. I've got a link to that as well. It's a wonderful, powerful book that I can't recommend more. Thank you so much for listening. For more information about this, remember, just go to empoweredchangece.com. That'll give you all those links and show notes. Also, find us on Facebook, empowered.change.ce. Come on, let me know what you think of these. I really would love your feedback. I want to know more about how these are going, the interviews, the stories. I want to know how to make these most enjoyable for my listeners. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing your day with me. Again, this is Tim Winnecke with Empowered Change. Thanks for listening.